If you're not really sure where to focus in your private practice, maybe you're a little frustrated with your growth, or maybe you're at a place where your growth is getting to a place where it's becoming a little bit unmanageable for you. One of the best ways to learn how to manage everything better, from bringing in new clients to getting the systems and processes in place you need for your private practice, is to take part in some coaching or consulting. And one of the best ways to do that is through a mastermind group, because it's a very cost-effective way to get together with a group of trusted peers that can help you solve some of the same things that they're going through. So I would invite you to join the mastermind group that's about ready to start in September 7th in 2018. We've got just a few spots left, and I'd love to have you join me for that group. If you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com/mastermind, you can apply there, and we'll just simply have a conversation and talk about whether it would be a good fit for you or not. Love to have you, so go over and apply today. This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. This is session number 48 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, everyone. I'm Gordon Brewer, your host, and I'm so glad you have joined the Practice of Therapy podcast and chosen to listen to this podcast. As I was thinking about recording the intro to this podcast, it dawned on me that this podcast has now been in existence for 1 year. That is hard to believe. I don't know why I wasn't paying more attention to that. But anyway, I started the podcast. I think the first episode came out on August 27th of 2017. So as I'm recording this, it's August 28th. So happy birthday to the Practice of Therapy podcast. It's a huge accomplishment for me. And I thank all of you that are following the podcast and have been faithful listeners. I was looking at the metrics, and I bet by the time this podcast comes out, we will have had over 10,000 downloads of the podcast. So, it's not necessarily all about me, but I'm so thankful for all of you that have listened and have tuned in and continue to tune in to the podcast. If you haven't listened to the podcast before, I'd really invite you to subscribe and, share it with others, and give us a review, and wherever you might be listening to the podcast, whether it be on iTunes or on Stitcher or Google Play or Spotify, iHeartRadio. I think those are most of the places that I'm showing up now. So anyway, glad you're here, and so happy to kind of celebrate this milestone of the podcast making it to its 1 year anniversary. I think one of the things about that I've learned in my own private practice journey is just the importance of being persistent with things and consistent. And that's what I try to do with the Practice of Therapy content, and getting out meaningful stuff to people and sharing it with you all. And but more than anything else, I just want it to be helpful and help you to learn more about private practice. You've got lots of choices out there about podcasts, and I would encourage you to listen to more than just mine. I've got several good friends that are in this space. Joe Sanok, to mention one. Alison Pidgeon. Allison is another one. Also, Melissa Hall over at Biz Besties. And I've got coming up, and here in a few more episodes, Kate and Katie over at Private Practice Startup. We've connected, and we're going to be doing some things together in terms of just sharing on each other's podcasts. So if you're a follower of them, I hope to be on there. They'll be on this podcast here later this year, depending on my schedule here. And So lots of great friends out there in this whole private practice space. And there's so many resources that are great resources. And again, I thank you for taking a look at what I've got going and looking at my spin on it. So today on the Practice of Therapy podcast, I've got another great private practice consultant that's joining me, Alison Pidgeon, who some of you might know Alison from the Practice of the Practice, Joe Sanok's website and podcast. Alison works with Joe and is one of the consultants over at the Practice of the Practice. And Alison and I had a conversation. As I'm recording this, we did this yesterday, so this is a quick turnaround on this podcast for me. But Alison has done a phenomenal job in growing her practice, and she just brings so much expertise and knowledge to this whole private practice space and knowing how to put systems in place. She has built a group practice, and one of the big things that we talked about in this episode was just what it's like to buy a building. I know for me, I bought the building that I'm in last July, and Alison has done the same. She just recently purchased the building that she's moving her practice to. And so we had a great conversation around that and what that was like and some of the benefits for doing that. So anyway, Alison, as I said, has done a phenomenal job with growing her practice and has really got quite a thing going. And so there's a lot to learn from her. So without further ado, here is Alison Pidgeon. Well, hello, folks. Welcome again to the Practice of Therapy podcast. And I'm so happy and really thrilled to have Alison Pidgeon with me today. And Alison is another one of those colleagues and friends that I've just kind of connected with over really this last year through our friend Joe Sanok. Joe's always at the hub of all this. So if Joe's listening to this, he knows that he's stirring the pot a lot with a lot of people. So, but anyway, Alison, so glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes, I'm glad that you're here. So Alison is in private practice in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Correct.
And she has a group owner. Owns a group practice. And Alison just recently did something huge, similar to what I did last year, and she bought a building. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But Alison, tell folks a little bit more about yourself and your private practice journey and how you've landed where you've landed.
Thanks, Gordon. So my practice is called Move Forward Counseling. We are a boutique private practice focused on women's issues. And I started out my career working in a nonprofit community mental health. And over the course of 8 years, kind of worked my way up to managing 2 different outpatient clinics. And I had a staff of 14. And I got super burned out. I had a baby and a toddler at home, and I just couldn't juggle everything anymore. And, you know, the demands are always getting more, but they're not giving you any more time or resources to get things done. And I just decided it was time to do something else. So I left and started my own private practice and really kind of jumped in with both feet, like put together a practice in 6 weeks. And some of my clients came with me and realized then when I was doing some research into the business of private practice that it made a lot of sense to start a group practice for a lot of reasons. And so I was pretty comfortable with managing staff because of the work that I had done previously. And so I started hiring people and, you know, made a lot of mistakes along the way. But once I figured out kind of the systems and the processes, then I just kept replicating it and we just kept growing and growing. So right now I have 6 therapists. I'm about to have my 7th start next month. And since we bought the new building, I'm actually in the process of hiring about 5 more clinicians. So
wow.
Yeah, so hopefully there'll be about 12 of us in the next few months. And I have 2 assistants as well.
Wow, that's great. That's great. That's and that's you. I think you said that's happened over how long of a period of time?
So it's been about 3.5 years since I started my solo practice.
Oh, wow, wow, that's pretty phenomenal growth.
Thank you.
That's great. So, yeah, so you did the pulled the trigger like I did. Tell folks a little bit about the process you went through of thinking about buying a building, and you know why you went that direction as opposed to leasing a space and all of that.
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in real estate. That was something I always kind of had a dream about, like, oh, maybe one day I'll have rental properties, or, once I got into doing the private practice, I was like, oh, maybe one day I'll be able to buy a building. And I didn't know too much about it. And so I just thought, oh, I'll just start like saving my pennies. And then maybe like 10 years from now, I'll be able to afford to buy a building. But then I started doing some research into it and found out that there's so many different ways you can finance commercial real estate. And it just so happened that I had a former colleague of mine approach me about going in with her on buying a commercial property. And so that's actually how I ended up being able to purchase the property much sooner than I thought, because I was able to take out what's called a hard money loan from her for the down payment.
Mm-hmm.
So far I have bought this building with none of my own money.
Wow. Yeah, that was something for me. I know when I started looking at this building that I'm in now, it was really just kind of, it almost fell in my lap in that, I really wasn't really thinking that much. I knew I needed to move to a bigger office space because I'd outgrown where I was. And so I was just looking around and saw this building and started, had a friend that was a real estate agent. And I said, well, tell me what we need to do to get this. And fortunately, it had been on the market for a while, and I got it for a steal, really. And so it just really, and I think, a lot of times people are really intimidated by doing something that big.
Yeah. And I think, like I said, once I started doing research into it and really understanding it, then I felt a lot more confident, like taking that on. And obviously too, like I talked to my lawyer, my CPA, my real estate agent, and gathered all my information that way too. So I think at this point, I feel pretty confident about, it makes a lot of sense for me financially. But also I think it's just going to be really fun to have my own space, and it's undergoing a major renovation. Pretty much the inside is going to be gutted, so I can make it exactly how I want it to be, which is awesome.
That's great. Yeah. So, I know one of the things we were talking about before we started recording was just really kind of this whole concept around creating passive income within your practice and being able to, I know that's something that I've blogged about and talked about on other podcasts, is just being able to diversify your income. You want to tell people maybe a little bit why that's so important and something that people should think about as they grow?
Yeah, I think as an entrepreneur, you should always be looking about having multiple streams of income, because we all know, the therapy practice can ebb and flow, right? Like in the summertime, it might slow down, and then you might be a little bit worried about, oh no, how am I going to cover everything? And so if you have other streams of income, obviously you have a lot more cushion, because, if one thing is slowing down, then hopefully something else is still, giving you some cash flow. So that's a question that we get asked a lot by consulting clients. And something that I know we often talk about is like, oh, you could, write an ebook, you can make an e-course. But what I don't hear a lot about is people talking about real estate, because we all have offices. 95% of us need to use an office. And so you could be, paying somebody else rent and making them rich, or you could be owning your office. Eventually you're going to pay it off, and then you're just going to be, realizing all of that cash flow coming through from the tenant, even though the tenant is you. And so I think it's just something, like I said, we don't often talk about, but I think it would be a great idea for therapists to own their own office.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, and I think that's the thing is that, with as many people discover, especially as they grow their practices, they reach kind of this, I don't know if you would call it a glass ceiling, but reach this ceiling where there's only so much time they can devote to seeing clients. And ultimately, I guess our number one source of income is trading our time for money, really. I mean, just trading our expertise and time with clients for the money they give us. And you can only see so many clients in 1 week, and you can only, and most of us went into private practice because we wanted to kind of cut back on the amount of time we're spending with clients and spending time with our families and being able to do that, take time off when we want to do that. So
Right.
That's been true for me, as well as being able to find those other ways of diversifying income, which I think is a reason probably why you and I both went into doing consulting.
Right. Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have a story that perfectly illustrates this point. I work with a nonprofit foundation. I do some charity work with them, and I was talking to the executive director about my plan to buy an office, and she said, "Oh yeah, we ended up buying this office." She said we had rented for a long time, and the owner came to us and said he was retiring and wanted to sell it, and basically was offering it to us first since we were already in here. And she said we formed a whole committee to do research about should we buy or should we keep renting. And she said what the committee figured out was they had already bought the office condo twice over.
Oh, wow.
And so it made a lot of sense to buy it because they had spent so much money on rent over the years.
All right. And I think, you think about that with home ownership too, and I guess a big part of it depends on what part of the country you're in as to what is affordable and what is practical for that.
Right.
Of where you are
right.
in the country or the world, as far as that goes. So to switch gears a little bit, Alison, I know one of the things that you and I have both kind of worked on at times is just this whole thing about how to decide if we're going to accept insurance and be on insurance panels. And that I think is sometimes a hard decision for people. And you want to talk a little bit about how I know that you are on insurance. You're basically an insurance-based practice like mine. So how did you come to that conclusion versus just doing strictly a cash-based practice?
Yeah, I think when I started out, I didn't know any different. I just came from that, nonprofit community mental health world. And I just assumed you just get on every insurance panel you can. And that's just what you do. And then the more and more I learn about, private practice world, I realized for a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily make sense to take insurance. And what I've learned too, and in my practice is I've slowly gotten off of panels over the years, because really if they're not paying you a certain amount, you're losing money on seeing their clients. So I've sort of figured out what is my, my break even point. And so we got off all the panels that weren't at least the break even point. And now really we're only on the panels that are above that number. So I think for some people, especially depending on your niche, for example, couples therapists, I usually recommend to my consulting clients, it's not worth taking insurance because they're going to pay you less than they are to see an individual. And, couples counseling is such a in-demand service because there's not a ton of them out there. So, therapists that do EMDR, because they typically want to do 90-minute sessions. I recommend to my consulting clients, I'm like, it just might not be worth taking insurance because insurance, and EMDR treatment doesn't really jive together. I think too, it depends a lot on your geographic area. For example, if you're in New York City, almost everybody has a self-pay practice, versus if you're in a more rural area where there's not a lot of money, you're probably going to have to take insurance.
Right. Right. And I think that's really kind of my advice as well, is to understand the demographics of your area. I know we're in a kind of a mid to small metropolitan area, but it's surrounded by this huge rural area. And so it's really difficult. Part of it, I think the other part of it too is just looking at your own values around that. I know for me, one of the reasons that I stay on insurance panels is that I know that there's a lot of people out there that won't come to therapy unless they can use their insurance.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't afford my full fee anyway. And so it's a way for them to get the services that they need.
Right. Yeah. And I think it also depends on your own philosophy too, as a therapist, because I know this debate always seems to be very polarizing for people.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're either like in this pro insurance camp or you're in this pro self-pay camp, and there's like no middle ground. But I think there can be a middle ground, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what other fun stuff are you doing now with your practice? And you're getting ready to add more clinicians, and I'd say you've learned a lot over the last 3 years. And you've, like me, you've learned a lot of stuff the hard way. And so if somebody is thinking about growing their practice, what would be some advice you would give them?
Yeah, I mean, 3.5 years into it now, I realize that if I had to go back and do it over again, there's some things I would have done differently. And I think in the beginning, because it was so rushed that I left my old job and started the private practice, I didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about, okay, what do I want this to look like 3 to 5 years from now? And so I think if I had known that, I would have made some different decisions along the way. Like this whole reason that we're moving into this building is because we've run out of space in our current building. And that really, was a major obstacle to me continuing to grow. And so I think if I had thought ahead, like, okay, the first 3 years I'm going to hire, 8 people. By year 5, I want to hire 12 people. Like I could have sort of laid the foundation differently, and sort of avoided some of these growing pains that we're experiencing.
Right. So, tell folks a little bit about your hiring process and, maybe how you've got your group structured. I know that's been a hot topic for us in our Facebook group, is just about, group structure and compensation and all of that.
Yeah. We had a nice debate there going about W-2 versus 1099 and all the different implications that go along with that. And yeah, so right now my practice is structured that my admins are actually W-2 employees, and my therapists are contractors.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did it that way because the admin job had gotten so large that it really did turn into a W-2 job in terms of me telling them how to do their job. So I felt like just legally I needed to make that shift, and it actually wasn't as difficult as I thought. Really, I just got them workman's comp insurance and I got them on payroll, and that was really all I had to do differently. So I decided to keep the therapist contractors because that was a little bit more complicated to look at making the switch to W-2s. Not that I wouldn't consider it in the future. I think just right now with moving into the new building, it just may be not the time to make another huge change. But I feel like it works really well to have them as contractors because they get the flexibility of the schedule and they get to see how many hours they work, and there's no productivity requirement. And my therapists are all very independent. They're all licensed. They have, outpatient therapy experience. So I really like that I feel like I don't necessarily have to be there all the time managing things, or, they're seasoned enough that they're not, asking me questions constantly. So it makes it nice that it just sort of runs like a well-oiled machine and I don't necessarily have to be there.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a big piece, is really taking the time to find the right people to join a group practice?
Yeah. And when I interview people, I assume if you're licensed that you're probably a pretty decent therapist. Like, I'm not so worried about your clinical skills because obviously other licensed people along the way thought you were, good enough to become licensed as well. So I'm more interested in asking them about sort of the fit and also how independently they can function. And do they sort of fit in with the culture that I have, created within my practice?
Right. I'd say there's some listeners out there that might be in this category of like you and I, how you and I started working for an agency, and they're really kind of getting disenchanted with that whole, grind of being in a mental health agency and having to keep up with the numbers and the caseloads and all of that. And they're trying to think if they want to go into private practice. And in my mind, and you tell me what you think of this, Alison, in my mind, there's really kind of two different ways a person, two kind of paths they can go. They could become a contractor or work for somebody else or start their own practice. And so in your mind, what would it take? What's the difference that it takes for that mindset, I guess? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So I think I get this question a lot actually from the people who are going through my mastermind group that are building a group practice. They're like, why would anyone want to come work for me? And I tell them it's because, some therapists don't really want to be bothered with the business stuff. They just want to come in and see clients and go home, and they don't want to have to worry about the marketing and the business structure and the contracts and all that stuff. But they still want all the perks of private practice, like the higher pay, the flexibility with the schedule, all that kind of stuff. So, so I think if you have that sort of business sense, or if you have some sort of drive to create this business and really make it your own, then you're probably going to do very well going off and forming a solo practice. If the idea of having to research that and figure all that out and create your own sounds terrible, then you should probably go work for somebody else in a group practice.
Yeah. And I think that's so true. I think one of the things is that it really requires somebody to be able to have a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit about them, and where they kind of like, I'm kind of an entrepreneur geek in a way, and that I listen to a lot of podcasts like Pat Flynn and it's just really wanting to learn about that, and really being able to create stuff is an important piece with that. And so, so I think, and I'm recognizing too, with just even my own staff, there's some of them that just really would just prefer to just, come in and have their caseload and be able to work when they want to and not have to worry about the marketing and all of that.
Yeah, that's what my staff tell me. They're like, we love it that you take care of all that for us and we don't have to think about it.
All right. Yeah. Well, Alison, what are some other things that you've learned with your practice is thinking about growth, and some good ways to think about growth that would be different?
Yeah, I mean, I think really for me, like figuring out that I had to put in these systems and these processes and get really efficient with those in order to keep on growing, I think was a really important mindset shift for me. Because in the beginning, I felt like I just sort of was winging it. And then I realized oh, okay, if I have these systems and processes in place, we can just keep replicating this and just keep hiring more staff and serving more clients. So, I think something a lot of therapists don't think about is too, once you put those systems and those processes in place, you need to be collecting data to see if it's actually working. And so we collect data on, referrals, where they're coming from, how many, if people call and we don't schedule them for some reason, the reason why, I'm always looking at like my accounting just to see like what's happening. Like, are the deposits like, the average amount that they tend to be every single week, or are they up, or are they down, and why? And so I think that's something that therapists don't often think about, is like, oh, I really need to be watching all of these metrics in this data, because that's going to tell me a lot about how things are going in my practice. And if I need to make a shift, like I'll look at how many calls do we have coming in, and then I'll know like, oh, I need to really ramp up the marketing because it seems like it's slowed down or whatever.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I'm continuing to learn as well. And as we talked about earlier from last week's podcast with Casey Compton, that was her superpower and able to build the organization that she's built, is that she got her systems and processes down pat before she took off and grew. And
yeah. And she and I have talked about that, and yeah, she's amazing at that.
Yeah. So when you think about your systems and processes, you talked about really looking at your metrics. Is that the right word?
Yes.
Anyway, looking at that and really kind of knowing the data. What are some other processes that you found are really kind of key to growth?
So in terms of how we sort of have clients coming in, or what?
Yeah, I guess. Say, tell me if this makes sense, or if I'm in the right ballpark. And I think about just our intake process for my office. We have a certain way that we do that, and so one of the things that I realized I need to do is really kind of document how we do that, so that, if anybody were to walk in, they say, okay, this is how we take in a new client, and this is how we assign it to a certain counselor or whatever. But the other thing is just thinking about when you hire counselors or hire new people, what are the processes that you need to have in place in order to onboard them? Mm-hmm. And I guess the other processes that I think about are just like you were talking about, with just being able to track how the money flows in and out of the business or out of the practice. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the intake process especially is a really good one to pay attention to, because it can take a lot of time. It can take a lot of time for the admin. It can take a lot of time for the therapist. It can take a lot of time for the client. So I feel like any way you can make that more efficient is great, because that can be definitely a big time waster, I guess you could say. So for example, like we have an EHR that has a client portal. So the client actually goes in there and can fill everything out electronically. They can sign it electronically. So we're not having to, print out paper. I feel like the EHR is really a lot of the backbone of that whole process, just making it super efficient. But also, like, we've written down the whole process of like, you need to gather these pieces of data, and this is what needs to be communicated to the therapist about the new client coming in and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, we've tried to really look at that and make it as streamlined as possible.
Right. And I think too, the intake person, which most of the time it's an admin, or at least I know there are a lot of people out there that do their own intakes, but I know one of the things that for my admin person, Nikki, I spent a lot of time really kind of training her about how to talk to people and how to get them in the door. One of the things that you just kind of taught me, though, I think one question that we do need to track is why, if people don't schedule, why they don't schedule.
Yeah. Because I feel like having an admin who is really good at talking to the clients on the phone is so important, because really, like, they're converting clients for you. Mm-hmm. And so that's another number that you could be looking at is, okay, there was 100 calls this month, and how many actually scheduled. And so if that number is low, then there's probably a problem with how the admin is talking to the person about the services. Mm-hmm. And so by tracking that number, you could figure that out. I think it would be, you're doing pretty good if you convert like 80% of the calls into.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. With the, another part of that you mentioned was just your EHR. And, I think about all the logistics around, phone systems, EHRs, all of that. How did you decide on what you wanted to use? Because there's so many out there.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions about that from consulting clients as well. So when I started in 2015, the two big ones were Simple Practice and Theranest. And at the time, Simple Practice was not set up to do group. I believe they are now, but Theranest was set up to do group. So it was pretty, easy to make that choice because I knew I wanted to start a group. And I know another big one now that I've heard good things about is Therapy Notes.
Yes.
Yeah. So, so it wasn't really, it wasn't like I somehow knew there was like tons of choices. I just knew of Simple Practice and Theranest and just sort of made the decision based on knowing I wanted to do a group practice.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's, I'm in the process of really kind of looking at my own EHR and do we need to change it and all of that. And so, but I think it's a good idea to kind of research that on the front end. I know Rob Reinhardt over at Tame Your Practice has a great EHR review. And again, another little shout out to Rob. He was on an earlier podcast, but that really kind of outlines which EHR. The other thing is just really looking at, with the EHRs is making sure it's got kind of the financial side of things kind of built into it so you can track things and look at those metrics on, where the money is coming in and going out.
Right. Yeah, that's what's nice about Theranest. They have a ton of different reports. And so that's actually how I know what to pay the therapist is because I can run a report and then I can see the amount of money they brought in a 2-week time period. Right.
Well, Alison, I know I'm aware of our time, and I know you've probably got a busy day ahead since we're recording on a Monday. So, but what are some other things, kind of parting thoughts you would leave with folks about growing a practice and about what you'd want them to know about you?
Yeah, so I guess we haven't really talked too much about the work that I do with Joe for practice.
Yeah. Talk about that.
Yeah. So I work for Joe as a business consultant, and I've been working with him actually for about 2 years now. And what's great about it is that we've sort of been able to separate out folks according to, what they need help with. And we all kind of have our specialties, just like, a therapist has their specialty. As consultants, we have our own specialties. And so mine is working with more of the beginner startup phase people, and then also working with people who want to start a group practice. And so I'm on my third mastermind group, which is called Start a Group Practice Mastermind. That's starting in September. And it's been really cool. I ran two over the kind of the winter, springtime, and it's just been really cool to see over a 6-month process, like people go through the journey of knowing really nothing about starting a group practice to the end. They had made like huge strides. Like they had hired like multiple clinicians by the end of the 6 months and were doing awesome. And it was just so gratifying to see, how much they had grown in that short period of time. And so I love doing it, and I can't wait to start another one. I have kind of changed things up a little bit, I think, to make it even more valuable to everybody. So.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's, one of the things that I think is, people hear this from me a lot. And, one of the things that I learned that if I had to do it over again was not to do too much alone and not try to do too much on my own. And I know for me, the mastermind groups that I've been involved in have just been absolute game changers in terms of being able to see other possibilities. I mean, we don't know it all. And so and that's the whole the whole idea behind the word mastermind is that when you get a group of people together that have expertise in different areas, they form a mastermind. And
Right.
that's, yeah. And so we just, I've always been fascinated by that anyway, but I know it's a huge thing. So,
Yeah. What's
yeah.
amazing to me is we were at Slow Down School a few weeks ago, and that group of people there was obviously very like-minded, and how many of them just saw the return on investment with investing in some kind of business coaching or consulting. And some of them even told me, like, before they joined Joe's group, they had tried other groups and had paid for other courses and things, and they just saw how valuable it was. And I think just looking at that group and what they've accomplished, like
Mm-hmm.
the knowledge and the accountability and the just all the progress that they've made as a result of being in that group is incredible.
Right, right. And it's, yeah, and I'm a big proponent of it. And I'm in the process of getting a mastermind group going myself. And so that's, I just would invite people, find one that fits for you. I mean,
Right.
that's so important.
Right.
It might be that, mine might not be the greatest fit for everyone, but just find out about the ones that are out there, because there's so many resources now for people going into private practice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, because I think you have to feel like you kind of resonate with that person, which is actually why I had picked Joe as my business consultant before I started working for him, because I
Mm-hmm.
feel like we have sort of similar mindsets and how we see business, and just kind of breaking down the nuts and bolts of, how practice works and that kind of thing.
Right, right. So, yeah. Well, Alison, I'm so glad you've been with me today on the podcast. Tell folks how they can get in touch with you if they want to get in touch with you, and I'll be sure and include all of this information in the show notes as well.
Okay, great. Yeah. So if you are interested in connecting about consulting, you can email me. It's Alison. So Alison with one L, ALISON at practiceofthepractice.com. I also have a page on Joe's website that I think is kind of long to say, but we could post it in the show notes. And there's also a contact form on there that you can fill out if you're interested in getting in touch.
Okay, great. Well, Alison, thanks again for being with me, and I'm sure we'll be chatting again here soon.
Yes, definitely. Thank
All right.
you.
Take care.
You too.
One of the things that I keep learning over and over, and it's been kind of a theme here lately, is just the importance of having great systems and processes in place for your practice. And really, that's what you have to have in order to scale and grow. If you don't have your framework, kind of your foundation there, it's going to be difficult to grow. And I heard that, I've learned that a lot here lately. I know, as I mentioned in this episode, talking with Casey Compton last week on the previous podcast episode about that. And that is really where she has just absolutely knocked it out of the park, is by putting in the systems and processes she's got in place to grow a practice to the $1 million mark. And so it's pretty impressive stuff. Next week, I am so excited about next week's podcast. In fact, I was losing a little bit of sleep over it last night. I'm going to have Mike Michalowicz, who is the author of Profit First and his new book, which is called Clockwork. About designing your business to run itself. And in that book, I'm about halfway through it now. That's all that he talks about, is putting the systems and processes in place for your practice. And so it's not specifically for private practice, but it's about small business or running businesses. So Mike is a nationally known best-selling author, and I'm just just a little, quite honestly, a little bit starstruck with him joining the podcast. So stay tuned for that. That will be out in the next episode. It'll be episode number 49. So anyway, tune into that and mark your calendars. Should be out the first of next week. So whenever you're listening to this, it might be that you're listening to this in the future, and it's just click over to the next episode. So thanks again, folks, for joining me on the podcast. And I really do appreciate the fact that you're listening to this and choosing to listen to the podcast. Do take a look at the resources in the show notes. We've got Alison's information there about her contact information and the mastermind group she's doing with Joe Sanok. And my mastermind group, the Growth Phase Mastermind Group, is getting ready to start. And so I've got, like I said, as mentioned at the beginning, got a few slots left, and I'd love to have you apply. And you can get to that at practiceoftherapy.com/mastermind. And so go over there and apply to that. Take care, folks, and do tune in next week because it's going to be a great episode. Take care. Bye-bye. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. If you haven't already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.